Exciting topic on police and fire pension fund. We're eager to get a great update from you all. So welcome.
Council, thanks for the time. We go to this annual actuarial evaluation. Presenting today is Pat Beckham and Brian Hoagie, our consultants, our actuarial consultants, and Paul Lutomsky, our pension officer, and I'll let them walk you through things. You have the presentation in front of you. We do this on an annual schedule on the valuation, and we'll tell you the status of our police and fire pension. All right.
Well, welcome, Paul, Brian, and Pat. We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
She wrote them down.
I wrote it down.
I didn't get a chance to
I was
yet.
going to be really impressed.
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon. It is nice to be back with you. Again, we do this, once a year, and that 12 months seems to go by pretty fast. Our measurement date, a lot of the information that we gather is as of August 31st. So you're going to have really good memories and roll your brains back to August 31 of 18, particularly when we talk about things like rate of return, along with some demographic information on the members of the system. We're going to just walk through the presentation with you today. And if you have any questions, please ask them right as we go through, right? The information's fresh in your mind. So on slide 2, just a few comments in general about a retirement system like you have for police and fire members. Those are called defined benefit retirement systems because the benefit amount is defined by a formula, their years of service, and their salary. These are very, very long-term obligations. And those obligations are really the future benefits that'll be paid from the system. We obviously don't know exactly the amount of those, when they'll start, how long they'll be paid. We use actuarial assumptions to help us estimate those benefit payments, and then we put a value on them in terms of today's dollars, in this case, the August 31, 2018 valuation. So that's kind of the process behind the actuarial work. We know when we set these assumptions that they're not going to happen exactly every year. They're intended to be kind of long-term estimates, and we know there's going to be some up and down fluctuations, certainly on investment return, but really on all kinds of assumptions, whether it's salary increase, retirement. There will be variation from year to year. We'll talk a little bit more. We did an experience study in the last year where we look at each assumption that's used and decide whether we need to kind of change that to get a better estimate. So we have a little bit of information on that. The bottom line is we're really monitoring the funding progress on this long-term obligation and really setting the contribution rate for the following fiscal year. And so rather than take this extremely long-term obligation and decide the contribution is going to be this and put it on the shelf and worry about it 10 years later, we monitor it every year, because if we're off, good or bad, we want to adjust the contribution so we're ultimately hitting our target. And that's really what the valuation process is all about. So, slide 3. Again, our measurement date, the date we kind of stop the membership, look at that, and we measure assets, is August 31st of each year. So this is the August 31st, 2019 valuation. And again, we're using one set of assumptions. And there are clearly other sets of assumptions that are reasonable and could be used and would produce different numbers. The actuary's job is to really develop what we believe are best estimates for each assumption, make recommendations, and then the plan administrator ultimately makes a decision on adopting those assumptions. Again, the results of the August 31-19 valuation drive the recommended contribution for the city's fiscal year ending 8/31/2021.
Pat, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Are your set of assumptions ever changed?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's a perfect intro to the next page.
Oh.
Thank you so much. Slide 4.
See?
Yeah, I didn't even have to pay her for that. We study those assumptions every 4 years in depth. It's just good governance, and that's always been done. I believe historically it might have been every 5 years. The legislature actually made a change, so all of these types of plans in Nebraska review their assumptions every 4 years. So now we're on a 4-year schedule. This was the first experience study that our firm, Kavanaugh McDonald, had performed. The prior actuary did the prior experience study. So there were a number of changes, and that's pretty common in the first experience study that a new actuarial firm does. There's a lot of professional judgment involved. So in the future, yes, they will change. We would hope they would tend to be more fine-tuning or refining an assumption like retirement or termination. Investment return is a really important assumption, and that one is really in a state of flux right now for most systems. So there could be additional changes in the future, but again, we sort of look at the data we have and make our best estimate at the current point in time, knowing 4 years from now we will be revisiting all of these assumptions. So on page 4, you have a little table there that looks at the changes in the economic assumptions, okay? And the first row there is price inflation, and you can see that we had been using a 2.5% price inflation, recommending lowering that to 2.25%. And price inflation then sort of touches all the other economic assumptions, because both salary increases and investment return are influenced by that. So you can see kind of down the entire table, there's a 0.25% change in all of those. So the investment return is down from 7.5 to ultimately 7.25. We're kind of phasing that in, kind of 5 basis points each year for more of a gradual adjustment to the contribution rate instead of a big jump immediately. Same thing on wages. If inflation is lower, we would kind of think the sort of across-the-board increase in the salary scale would be a little bit lower. Because if price inflation is lower, generally wage inflation will be lower as well. And then the last row there, when we have an unfunded liability, we develop sort of a payment schedule, an amortization schedule. And since contributions are related to payroll, and in general payroll grows over time, we need an assumption to sort of model that payroll in the future and figure out how much money needs to come in to pay off that debt. That unfunded liability is kind of like the retirement system's debt. And so, again, we're using 2.75 for that assumption. But what's really driving most of those changes is that drop in price inflation. On the next page, we'll talk a little bit about demographic assumptions. So demographic assumptions are what happens to people: mortality, retirement, termination, disability. This plan is not really large from the number of people involved, and so we do look at the actual experience for each of those assumptions, but we use a lot of professional judgment in looking at that data and sort of deciding how much credibility to assign to it, how much to change the assumption to reflect what actually happened. We also don't just look backwards. We want to look forward to see, what happened in the past is one thing, but really the question is what's going to happen in the future, because all of our work is looking at future benefit payments. So one big change that happened in 2019 is the Society of Actuaries released a new family of mortality tables. That's not really exciting to most people, but actuaries dig it. It's pretty big news for us. Particularly this time, we have never, ever had mortality tables that were developed using public plan data, which is a little surprising because there's a lot of public plans in America, but we do now, and these tables will continue to be updated. So 2019, they released these Pub 2010, what it's called, and that set of tables, for the first time, besides being the first time for public data, also the first time that we had mortality experienced by occupation. So there is a table for general employees, there's a table for teachers, because you know the joke, teachers live forever, and a separate table for public safety, which again is really important in the public plan space. So we looked at that table, and again, you really don't have enough retiree data to make a lot of adjustments. So we go with pretty much a standard table. So we're going with the Pub S, that's public safety, 2010. That sort of sets the probability of death. But then we have what's called generational improvements, which just mean the probability of death goes down a little bit every year in the future. Okay? Anticipating younger people essentially are going to live longer than older people. So that improvement scale, how quickly those rates are going to change, we recommended that we use the same scale that the state retirement system uses. Thought being, they have a lot more data, and the general trend in mortality, if it's valid for the state retirement system, should be valid for the city of Lincoln. So that was really a key change. And then we made a couple of changes to the salary increase assumption and the retirement and the termination assumption to change them from being age-based to being service-based. Okay, because generally there's a stronger correlation to years of service than necessarily age. The longer people work for the city, it's less likely as they're going to leave, right? And the same thing with retirement, there's sort of a correlation with years of service when they hit a maximum benefit, and that generally is going to trigger retirement or drop. And so we thought that approach kind of made more sense. We looked at it both ways. There's definitely a stronger correlation there. And then when we looked at the disabilities, there were more duty-related disabilities than what we had assumed. So we moved part way. Again, there's not a lot of data, so we like to kind of move in that direction. And then if the next one shows there's fewer, we haven't kind of overcorrected. Okay.
So, James Michael had a question.
Can you just explain the salary increase based on service-based rates again? I think it just didn't stick in my brain, so if you could explain that again, I'd appreciate it.
So generally with salary increases, they are higher in the earlier years of service. Okay, if you think about your salary increases, generally kind of two things. What's going on in the general economy? Price inflation, general wage increase, but then the merit scale. You know, you get more seniority, you move up in the pay scale. You get a promotion, you move up, right?
Right.
And those tend to be heavily correlated to years of service.
Okay.
Generally higher at the younger durations.
That makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So again, kind of feels like, wow, there's a lot of changes, and there kind of is, and part of it is to bring your set of assumptions kind of more into the mainstream of what we see and use in other public plans. So, page 6, a lot of numbers. Sorry, this is an actuarial presentation, so we had to have a lot of numbers. These numbers are based on the 2019 valuation. So you have 3 columns. On the far left hand, it's old assumptions. So what would the 19 valuation have looked like if we had not changed assumptions that we just talked about? And then the next column is with the new set of assumptions. And then obviously the far right-hand column is just the difference between those two. So you can see under the old assumptions, the actuarial accrued liability, kind of how much of that obligation is assigned to years of service that have already been worked. So it would have been $311 million, and it went up to $325. Okay. And given the changes, we strengthened mortality, we lowered the investment return assumption. Those are going to tend to increase liabilities and costs. That change of $13.7 million, obviously the asset number doesn't change, flows straight down to the unfunded liability. But if you look at that increase, you know, looks like a huge increase, you have to really look at the first row to get a relative. So it's about up 4.5%. Funded ratio would have been a little bit over 81%, but with the new assumptions, we dropped to about 78%. So the bad news is, if your funded ratio is below 80%, you have to go visit the Nebraska Retirement Committee in the fall, which is really not a terrible thing. And I think you have a good story to tell because you're strengthening assumptions, and Brian will fill you in that we had some investment experience that was lower than expected. And you're not significantly below 80%.
Just to clarify, when you say you get to go, that doesn't mean the city council goes.
Oh, no.
That means Pat, and Brian, and I go.
Yes, a
That's what I was
representative.
thinking. Fantastic.
I'm sure if you really wanted to go, we could probably work that out. But most people don't. So that's already on Paul in my radar screen. And again, in the lower half of that table, it's a lot of pieces that are moving there. Normal cost is kind of, forget how much you have in assets or how little you have. What's it cost to provide the current benefits to your members based on our current assumptions? So we went from being, a little over 16.5% to 15.7 about. So that one went down, but you can see the unfunded liability went up, so your debt payment on that goes up. That's pretty straightforward. And then members are paying a part of this contribution, and what's left is the city's obligation. So under the old assumptions, the contribution rate would have been 17.21%, or about $9 million. And instead, with the new assumptions, 18.76, $9.7 million. So again, when you strengthen mortality and you assume you're going to earn a little bit less on your investments, that means it has to be made up in the form of higher contribution over time. So page 7, this is the column that says 8/31/19 valuation. You just saw these numbers, but it's comparing them to the 18 valuation. But remember, again, there are two different sets of assumptions in use there, so they're not totally comparable other than looking at really what the funding requirements are. So again, we were 82% funded in the 2018 valuation, would have been 81 under the old assumptions, but we're at 78, so a little under 80. There really isn't a magic number. Like 80 gets a lot of press, like if you're 80% funded, it's really good. And it is good, I don't want to play that down, but doesn't mean by itself everything's great, because you still need future money coming in. Just like if you had a low funded ratio, if you're putting a lot of money in the future, might still be actuarially sound over time. So it's really, you have to watch these kind of point in time measurements that can be misleading. And then just kind of bottom line, the actuarial city contribution rate last year in the 18 valuation was 16.52%, and it's up to 18.76 as we saw on the prior slide. Pause for just a minute. That's kind of high level what's going on. Brian's going to walk through a little more detail on kind of each piece, the members and the assets, so the liabilities and the contributions.
I only have one question. It's from an earlier page. It was page 4 on the general wage increase, and I'm curious, does that 25% reduction or change comport with our contracts, our union contracts?
Remember, these assumptions are long-term.
Yes.
So even if your current contracts, because inflation's been lower than 2.25, right?
Right.
So I would actually expect maybe your contracts are less than this.
Okay.
But we're trying to look at this over the span of a working career.
Okay.
So like 25, 30 years.
All right. Thank
And
you.
this is kind of where we think it'll be for the longer term. Okay, Brian, take it away.
Okay, so as Pat said, we'll get into a little bit more of the detail. So starting on slide 8, the first piece of the valuation is who's in this plan, the membership. And there's really a number of different groups. There's the active members, people that are currently working with the city. And that stayed about the same from last year to this year. Have about 590 active members. We have 42 members in DROP, this is a deferred retirement option plan, and so where a member may not go directly into retirement, still continue to work, but they need to kind of set their time frame 3, 4, 5 years until they will retire. So that's up a little bit from last year, and kind of skipping down to the very bottom. So I have about 1,200 members total in the valuation this year, up about 2%. So pretty steady from year over year, not too much movement in the data. On slide 9, a lot of numbers here. We're trying to come up with an effective member contribution rate, and what this means is all the members that are currently hired into the plan contribute 8% of pay, and that's for their whole career. Before this, and that's Plan A, before this Plan A was in effect, There's plans B, C, and an old plan where we still have a few straggling members. And in those plans, their contribution rates is that second column there, so anywhere from 7.6 down to 7%. But those contribution rates would stop after a certain number of years. So with plan, excuse me, with B and C, after 21 years of service, the member would stop contributing. Or with the old plan, after 26 years of service, the member would stop contributing. And so this is why we need to come up with an effective rate, because we have all these different members in different plans. And so it's not just 8% that everybody's contributing, we still have some of these old plan members. So all that said, kind of down the bottom right corner is the effective employee contribution rate, so that's 7.38%. And this number will continue to see increase towards 8% as we have new members come in, hired into Plan A, and we lose those old plan members. So if you kind of look at what's happened in the past, last year the effective rate was 7.23, the year before that was 7.2, so you can kind of see that it will continue to increase, and as the effective employee contribution rate increases, that reduces the city's portion, or city's contribution rate.
So do employees pay in every year of service,
So-
regardless now?
Yeah, they pay 8% of whatever their pay is in for however many years of service that they're here. Yep. So on slide 10, kind of talked about the membership, who's in the valuation. First piece of kind of the puzzle is how much assets do we have to fund these benefits for the future. And we do not use the market value of assets directly in the valuation. There's extreme volatility with market values, over the past week or month, kind of markets are all over the place. And so what we use is an actuarial value of assets, or a smoothed value. And this is really to reduce the volatility in the asset amount and to stabilize contributions a little bit more. The Lincoln Police and Fire uses a 5-year smoothing. So every year we're going to have some asset gains or losses or experience that doesn't meet what we expected to have. So if we're assuming a 7.5% return, not every year we're going to have a 7.5% return, and whatever is above or below that, we're recognizing 20% of that each of those next 5 years. On slide 11, you can kind of see it a little bit better in a chart formation or a graph, where the blue line is the market value of asset return. The red is the actuarial value, and then the green is our assumption. And so you can see that the blue is much more volatile, bouncing up and down quite a bit, whereas the red smooths it out a little bit more, and that's that actuarial value that we're using in the valuation.
Maybe before we leave that page, this will circle at the very end. Look at the blue line and how often is the actual rate of return close to the green line, which is the assumed rate? Not very often. I mean, it's usually far above it or far below it, and that's the volatility that's really the challenge in funding these plans. And we'll talk later about the impact that has on contributions.
So on slide 12, we have a little bit of the detail on the assets. Again, we're looking at snapshots, so this is a comparison of August 31, 2018 to August 31, 2019. So in market value, as of last year, we had about $246 million in assets, and then as of August 31, 2019, about the same, $246 million. So we brought in a little less than $12 million in contributions, paid out about $16 million in benefit expenses, and then as a rate of return, earned about a little over 2% on those assets. On an actuarial value, the same numbers come in and out, the contributions, benefit payments stay the same, but as far as the rate of return, it's higher. So it's a 5.9% return, and this is because of that smoothing. So last year we had some assets that were what we call deferred gains that smoothed in to help the return on actuarial value of assets. But that 5.9% is below what our assumption was. So we assumed we were going to earn 7.5% on assets. We were below that, and so what we'll see is we'll have an actuarial loss on assets, and that difference will flow through to our unfunded liability, or that debt that Pat was talking about that will need to be funded in the future.
So anytime you miss your assumption, whether it's positive or negative, you basically adjust your funding to sort of make it up in the future overall.
And so the actual value of assets is a little under 253 million, and that's the value that we will use in all the measurements. So when we're talking about funded ratio or how we're calculating contributions, this is the amount that gets used, not the market value, but the actuarial value of assets. So on 13, just a quick comparison of the funded status between last year and this year. Left column, the 2019 results. So the actuarial accrued liability in the first row is 325 million, up about 30 million from last year. The second row, the actuarial value of assets, again, this is the one we're using, not market value in all of our calculations, was up about 9 million, but liabilities were up more than the assets were year over year, and so our unfunded liability increases. So we're about 72 million in unfunded liability, which Pat had mentioned before, translates to about a 78% funded ratio versus last year we were about 82%. On slide 14, it's kind of a graph of the funded ratio, historical, kind of going back to see where we've been since 2001. Kind of see right after 2008, a steady decline after the Great Recession. In 2014 and 2015, there was a couple declines there, and those were change in discount rates. So we had lowered the assumed rate of return, which again increases liabilities or lowers the funded ratio. And then we had a big jump in 16 where we combined the COLA fund with the general plan. And then we're kind of hanging around 80% the last few years until this year we dropped a little bit more with the new assumptions that we changed with the system. On 15, we give a little detail on the change in the unfunded accrued liability, where we were at last year versus how we got to where we're at now. So as of August 31, 2018, had that 53 million in unfunded liability. The contributions were exactly what the actuarial amount was. So the city put in the same amount, so there's no change. That's at 0.0, so the city put in what was actuarially recommended. The 3.8 in investment experience, that's that difference between that 5.9% return on the actuarial value of assets and our 7.5% assumption. So that difference there, as I said, is an actuarial loss. It flows through to an unfunded liability and increases our unfunded liability. So that's that 3.8 million that increased our unfunded liability. Had a little bit of loss on liability experience. This was mostly due to mortality, or people were living longer than we had expected, which is good for the people, not as good for the system, so that increases our unfunded liability. And then the big change is the assumption changes, that 13.7 million that Pat had showed you before, to get to our 72 million of unfunded liability. That's 19. On 16, a graph similar to the funded ratio graph, kind of follows the same pattern, but it's the unfunded actuarial liability, just in billions of dollars. So again, from 2009 to 2014-ish, you kind of see it increasing, still all those losses flowing through from the Great Recession. And then from 18 to 19, that jump again, that is a big, what we just talked about on the last slide, that 13.7 million is a big chunk of the increase from the assumption changes. Just another way to look at that. For the actual contributions that go into, or that the city puts in, there's really two different components. There's what we call normal cost, or the ongoing cost of the system. So this is for any active member. Each additional year of service that they're accruing, we need to fund that, or we need to fund for these members accruing additional benefits. So that's the normal cost portion of it. And then the unfunded liability payment, or again, what Pat mentioned, that debt that needs to be paid off in a systematic way in the future. So those are really the two portions of the contribution. The unfunded actuarial liability payment is paid off as a level % of payroll, and it sounds fancy, but what this essentially means is, if you're paying, well, take a step back. If you're paying off a mortgage, you're paying off a level dollar. So you're paying the same amount every single month to pay down that debt. And that's a level dollar payment. We have a level percent of payroll, which means our payments, we're still gonna pay off the same amount, but every single year, our payments are scheduled to increase. So early on, we're not paying enough to cover interest, and then at the end, we ramp up and pay more than what we'd be doing. And so the payments are scheduled to increase 2.75% a year. So this is baked into the way the system is going to fund the plan.
Well, how much you're short on the interest on the unfunded depends somewhat on the length of the amortization period. And that's, the actuarial profession is getting really interested in length of amortization periods, and we may see some changes kind of down the road on that.
And the way we're paying off this unfunded liability is really what we call a layered amortization approach, and the detail of this is on slide 18. So again, a lot of numbers here. Coming down, there's these different amortization bases. So every year, we'll have a new base. So we're not gonna hit our assumptions exactly. We're not gonna be exactly 7.5% return on assets. People aren't gonna die on schedule. We're going to have some sort of gains and losses or difference in what our assumption was versus what actually happened. And that's where these bases come in, an experience base. And then for 19, we also have an assumption change base, that very last one. And the reason we have these bases is a little bit more transparent, so you can kind of see what is happening on a year-to-year basis instead of just having everything combined into one number where you have no idea what the different pieces are. So it's more transparent, and it should, in the future, reduce volatility as well, as we have payments being paid off every single year once we get out towards the end. So every new experience base is paid off over 20 years. And off to the far right is the total contribution. So we have that $72 million in unfunded liability. If you add up each of the different contribution amounts for the different bases, we have about $5 million that we will pay towards our unfunded liability. We take that down towards the bottom, divided by the projected payroll for that upcoming year, and that gives us a percent of payroll that we need to pay off this debt or this unfunded liability, that second part of that portion of the contribution amount.
One thing to look at maybe is the first row on that page, the 2016 unfunded liability base. You can see the original amount, was 54.6 million, and now it's 56.1 million. And that's when we're talking about, we call that negative amortization. The payment isn't covering the interest on it because the payment schedule has a lot of money coming in later. And that's where you can really see it, because that base started at 28. But if you look at like the row for 2018, you can see that because the period's shorter, there really has not been any negative amortization. So your policy is really trying to pay off those variations over 20 years. And in 5 more years, everything will be 20 or less. And so that's good news, because you're not paying that sort of, or not losing ground on the dollar amount of the debt. Okay?
Okay, so on 19, we kind of put everything together to get the total employer contribution rate. The left column, again, is this year's valuation. The right column is the 2018 valuation. And a thing to note here is that for the August 31, 2019 valuation, it's actually for the contribution for fiscal year beginning September 1, 2020. So we have a little bit of a lag from when we actually calculate the contribution rate versus when the contributions will be made. The first line, again, the normal cost, that ongoing cost of the plan, about 15.7% of pay. We talked about that member contribution rate, or that effective rate of 7.38. That reduces the city's portion of the contribution. So the employer normal cost is 8.33. So that's the ongoing cost of the plan for the city. And then we have on the that next line, that unfunded liability contribution rate at 10.43, which we had just looked at. That's that paying off of our debt. So you add up those two, that's where we get that 18.76% for the employer contribution rate. Take that times the projected payroll for this upcoming year, and we get an actuarial employer contribution of 9.7 million, up from last year of 8.4 million. Slide 20 just kind of shows in graph form the historical contributions for the city. You can see for most years that the city has put in at or right around where the actuarial amount has been. 15 was kind of a weird year. But 16, 17, 18 has been right on where what the city has put in with the actuarial amount, and then 19 and 20 kind of see the bump in 20. And then slide 21 shows the dollar amounts, kind of the same numbers that go into this graph. Where the first row, that fiscal year beginning September 1, 2020, that 9.7 million. And again, for the last year, it was 8.4 million. But if you look at what went in for fiscal year beginning September 1, 2018, that 8.3, the city put in that actual amount. And that's where, think back a few slides, when we're reconciling the unfunded amount, we had no change because the city put in the actuarial amount. So that was zero. And you can kind of see, going back, we've been fairly close to what the actual and the actuarial determined amount have been over the last 10 years.
And Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think with the ordinance change, the actuarial contribution has to be
It's a mandatory amount for the numbers in the 5-year budget table.
Right.
The 9.7.
And I would just toss in, we work with a lot of plans, and the well-funded plans are always the ones that contribute the actuarial rate. And so, kudos to you, because over the long term, you pretty much have done that. And now you've actually sort of institutionalized it in the ordinance, that commitment. So that's really important to funding this plan in the future.
Okay, and then slide 22. Again, a lot of numbers, but probably one of the more important slides here. This is the 5-year budget request estimate. Kind of going down or each of the next 5 years, starting with fiscal year 2020 through 2021. And then it has each of the different pieces broken out. So the first row, if you go across, we saw that 8.33 employer normal cost rate, the unfunded contribution rate, the 10.43, to give us the 18.76, and then working our way across in the far right column, the employer contribution amount. So that's that 9.7 million for fiscal year 2020 through 2021. One thing to note in these numbers of the next 5 years, this does have built in our projected assumption change. So as Pat mentioned, we are currently assuming we're going to earn 7.45% on our assets, and that's going to be stepping down each of the next 4 years. So when you look at the 21 through 22 fiscal year results, that's assuming a 7.4% return. And then following that, the 7.35, until we get down to a 7.25% assumed rate of return in that 5th row. So what that means is, if we're lowering our assumed rate of return, if we're not earning as much on assets, that needs to be made up somewhere, and so that gets made up in contributions. And so the contribution rate, the unfunded contribution rate, and the employer normal cost rate will come up to fund that lost income on investment return, if that makes sense.
So this is really our best estimate at this point, given what we know about the plan to reduce the investment return and the deferred investment experience. The wild card is, what will the return be for the current fiscal year and the next fiscal year, and that'll all, so the further out you go, the less reliable perhaps it is, the more unknown variables there are.
Yeah, and this does assume that all assumptions are met. So this assumes that this next year we're going to earn 7.45% on our assets. Whether that happens, who knows?
Good luck.
Probably not going, yeah, exactly. And so if we're lower than that, these numbers, again, go up because we missed our assumption. So this is assuming all assumptions are met into the future. Okay?
All right, we just have a couple other slides to share with you. There was a new actuarial standard of practice that was effective with the 2019 valuation. It has to do with measurement and evaluation of risk in pension funding. Actuarial standards of practice are sort of a best practice, I'd say guide, but as credentialed actuaries, we're bound by those standards. But there's a very strong focus on risk management in the profession. And so I'm sure we're not done with hearing some of the risk-related information. We didn't want to kill you with it, but we wanted to introduce a couple of new kind of concepts that we haven't really talked about before. And one is on page 23. It's called the asset volatility ratio, and it's just simply the ratio of the market value of assets to covered payroll. And the greater that number, the greater that ratio, the more potential volatility there is on the contribution side. And that's where the rub comes in when you're trying to budget, right? That variability can really be problematic. So you can look, and the data's here for, about 10 years. The assets have grown, over that time period about 7%, but payroll's only grown about 4%. So the ratio of the two is increasing. Very common in mature plans. That's how it's supposed to work, right? It's supposed to put money away, it's supposed to grow with investment income, and it should grow faster than payroll. But what that means is when there's a miss on investment return, it's a very large percent of payroll, which is how we're developing the contribution rate. So just the very bottom line for 8/31/19, the asset volatility ratio is 5.12, which means that if we miss on the rate of return by 10%, which is not, happens given the portfolio expected return and that sort of standard deviation is a measurement of volatility around the expected return, that would likely be expected to happen either positive or negatively about, what, a third of the time? So that's not uncommon, once every 3 years. That could change the contribution rate almost 4% of pay. Now, we have tools, we do the asset smoothing over 5 years, but the ultimate impact is a pretty big number, and that's a couple $1 million for the city of Lincoln. So it's just more to be aware. It's not, necessarily a bad thing, because the better funded you are, the higher that ratio is, but just to understand the dynamic and the impact as you accumulate these assets, that sort of missing on the return has a very significant impact on the funding side of the equation. Page 24, this is called a sensitivity analysis, and because all we're changing is one thing, and that's the investment return assumption. So the middle set of numbers here is the valuation results that Brian just went over with you, and then we have kind of a plus 0.5%, minus 0.5%. So if the investment return assumption was 7.95 and all the other assumptions are not changed, you can see with the valuation, the required contribution rate would go down to 14.68%. Employer contribution would go down 7.7, and the funded ratio would be 82. Likewise, if we went down 0.5% to 6.95, the contribution would be over 23% of pay. The employer contribution would be close to 12 million. Funded ratio would be 73. It's amazing, like what seems like a little change on investment return is extremely powerful. Because remember, in general, the rule of thumb is about 65% of all the money that goes to pay benefits comes from investment income. So when you dial that back, like Brian said, it has to come from somewhere, and we haven't used this equation. It's required to use it in every actuarial presentation, so now I'm going to use it. C plus I equal B plus E. Forget E, it's like administrative expenses. Paul's really, really frugal. So contributions plus investment income pay the benefits. So when you say sort of right up front, if you change the investment return, you say I is going to be lower, B pretty much isn't changing.
No.
C's got to come up. It's a long-term balance equation. And this is just quantifying it to help, again, try trying to help people understand the impact and why that assumption is so important and so powerful. So we are grading down, phasing into 7.25, just exactly in the middle of these two, but kind of close. So you can kind of get a sense of the ultimate impact if we did it right now, would move the dial to a contribution rate somewhere around maybe 21%. Things will change over time, payroll and things like that will change, but it's the right thing to do, but there's a cost associated with lowering that assumed rate of return. Trying to make it a little more gradual, helping from a budgetary standpoint. So I think there's one more slide, which we've already touched on all of this. I think Brian pointed out, the big change this year was the assumption change. It was 14 million increase in unfunded liability. There's no denying that is the big news. But we also had a return on market value that was about 2%, a little over 2%, when the expected was 7.5%. Pretty big change too. We've recognized part of that, but there's still some that's got to kind of work through the pipeline in the next 4 years. So it would be really great if the market came roaring back by 8/31. If anybody has any control over that, put a word in, would you? But we know, and the slide, a couple slides ago, it showed that asset volatility ratio. Investment return is the key driver of the funding and therefore the contribution requirements. And so darn volatile, it really creates a lot of challenges. But you guys are doing a lot of things right. Keep doing them, and I think, it pays off. Any other questions? If not, thank you.
All right, Brandon.
There you
One
are.
thing in relation to this, there's a first reading item on the council agenda. If you've seen, there's a transfer to police and fire pensions. So, along with the policy change that the council made in May of 2017, there's that annual amount that's actuarially required that we meet. So, as we discussed in the mid-biennium, we fell short in revenues in some areas. And this pension requirement was impacted by that. So where we know what our experience was for 18-19, and we came in 326,000 short. We're estimating about 350,000 for the current 19-20 fiscal year. So we're asking for a transfer into the police and fire pension fund up to that 656,000. We're recommending that come out of the contingency appropriations and the general fund reserve. So that's on for first reading, just so you're aware. If you have questions, please come talk to me or Paul or Doug and I, and we'll answer anything. But it's really, before, like you said, we came in above or below that certain required amount, but now we have to meet that legally. So this is the amount that we need to transfer to meet that legal requirement.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
Is that a one-time payment?
Yeah, that's a one-time.
You've got it scheduled to pay on a certain day?
We'll go ahead and pay the 18-19 in, and then we'll watch on the 19-20. We've got an estimate in there, and we believe it's a higher estimate than what will come in. So once we know the actual numbers for the 19-20 year, then we'll transfer that over.
When will you know those?
We typically get our last distributions around August, which is right at the end of our fiscal year. So once we get our last distributions in and any interest earnings from cash on hand, we should be able to make a transfer after that.
So we know that for the next biennium, we're going to be looking at 19.8 million.
And luckily, we got those numbers early.
Yep.
So we included that, incorporated in the forecast. So there's not any large increase or realistic expectation that we haven't already heard, I guess, from them. So it's a good thing we have the numbers early, especially when we came to you all in January.
That's great. Any other questions?
You won't go off. You may have questions for me later.
Okay.
I want to know what a layered amortization is. We'll know that later.
Well, That slide really shows you.
Yeah.
What slide is that?
So if it wasn't a layered amortization, it would be all those bases combined. So how we have the,
The bottom.
yeah, the 5 different rows, yeah, 5 different rows, they would just be all combined, so it would just be the total.
Oh,
So the layered amortization is really
Showing all
showing each of them, yeah, pieces, bases or
And every
pieces.
year, there's a new piece until, I guess, the ones that are over
Yeah.
20 drop off. I won't be reporting that, just FYI.
Okay. Terrific. Well, seeing no further questions, thank you all very much for this very important update. Impacts our budget.
Thank you. Good to be
Okey-doke.
here.
Thank you.
speech.
Now, did you all want to go right into director's meeting?
Yes.
Okay.